Hi, welcome today here to Brown Bag Lit. We're really happy to see you here and welcome you. My name is Chloe Miller. Shasta Grant and I started Brown Bag Lit this January, and today we're happy to welcome you to hear two great writers, Julia Kolchinsky Dasbach and Jehanne Dubrow, to hear them read from their new books that hopefully you've had a chance to read, and if not, will soon. And the title of today's talk is Circling History, Writing What the Body Carries. We hope you'll join us here at Brown Bag Lit for a future class or reading. We're offering one poetry class and one prose class a month, as well as our monthly first draft club. Our next class is this Thursday, a poetry class on silence with me. And the following Thursday, both from 12 to 2, Shasta will be offering a prose class titled Growing Roots, How to Write Place-Based Stories or Essays. Our next reading is on Monday, November 6th, Awakening, Stories of Bodies and Consciousness, which is an anthology edited by Diane Gottlieb. You can learn more about us on our website, brownbaglit.com. Follow us on social media, and we'll put all the links into the chat. So right now, I would like to welcome Shasta Grant, a Brown Bag Lit co-founder, who will introduce Julia and Jan. Thank you.
Hi, thanks, Chloe. It's my pleasure to introduce Julia and John today. Julia Kolchinsky Dasbach is the author of 3 poetry collections, 40 Weeks from YesYes Books, Don't Touch the Bones from Lost Horse Press, winner of the 2019 Idaho Poetry Prize, and The Many Names for Mother, winner of the Wick Poetry Prize from Kent State University Press. And she was a finalist for the Jewish Book Award. She is currently working on a poetry collection as well as a book of linked lyric essays, both of which grapple with raising a neurodiverse child with a disabled partner under the shadow of the war in Ukraine, Julia's birthplace. Her poems have appeared in Poetry, Ploughshares, American Poetry Review, The Nation, and AGNI, among others. Julia holds an MFA in poetry from the University of Oregon and a Ph.D. in comparative literature and literary theory from the University of Pennsylvania. In the fall of 2023, Julia joined Denison University as assistant professor of English and creative writing. Okay, and Jehanne Dubrow is the author of 9 poetry collections and 3 books of creative nonfiction, including most recently exhibitions, essays on art and atrocity, University of New Mexico Press. Her next book of poems, Civilians, will be published by Louisiana State University Press in 2025. Her writing has appeared in New England Review, Poetry, and the Southern Review, among others. She is a professor of creative writing at the University of North Texas. Welcome, Julia and John. Thank you.
So I think I'm going to start first, and I'm going to be reading from one essay in my new book, Exhibitions, Essays on Art and Atrocity. I'm the daughter of American diplomats, and I grew up all over the world. And so these essays take as their starting point pieces of art, mostly that I was raised with in my parents' house. But often they're a jumping off point for meditating on the landscapes that we were residing in. And we were frequently in places that were sites of trauma, places of genocide or war. So this essay that I'm going to read from is called The Red Picture and the Blue, and it's about the former Yugoslavia. According to the story, my third word after mommy and daddy was picture. In Zagreb, where I spent the first 2 years of my life, my mother lifted me from my pram to see the pictures of art. Look at the picture. On sunny days, we took the funicular from our apartment in the old section of the city downhill to the lower, newer portion, where we visited galleries or just toured the neighborhoods. Or we wandered closer to home through cobblestone streets to St. Mark's Church with its ecstasy of colored roof tiles only a few blocks away. Even if we stayed indoors, we could gaze down from the windows of our apartment into the courtyard of the Mestrovich Atelier, a gallery dedicated to one of Yugoslavia's most renowned artists. The rumor went that years before, Mestrovich himself had slept in the very rooms where we now slept, had eaten where we ate, had regarded the same medieval views of Zagreb. Our dining room, which was punctuated with a series of rounded alcoves, once displayed the sculptor's works in progress. And so I kept saying, picture, picture, picture. I stretched my hand toward the beautiful. In my first year, laid on the living room floor, I pulled lint from the wool rug, rolling the soft balls of color between my finger and thumb. My mother swears she used to find me arranging these kernels of bright lint in intricate patterns, placing small nubs of orange beside specks of yellow and green. I could stay like this for hours, my liquid infant gaze focused on the swirl of design and hue. Already I saw the flowers woven in the carpet and made my own in turn. It was the mid-1970s, my parents' first post. Before my birth, they spent a little over a year in Belgrade, after which they moved to Zagreb, where my father was the deputy cultural affairs officer. At the U.S. Cultural Center, the Foreign Service nationals called me Sweetica, the English word paired with the affectionate Serbo-Croatian diminutive Ica, little sweetie. I was so tiny, my father could fit my head in his palm, my feet barely reaching the crook of his arm. At the end of our 4 years in Yugoslavia, less than a week before we were about to leave for our next assignment, this time in Zaire, my parents received a phone call. Good news. Mirsad Berber, the great Bosnian Muslim painter, had agreed to sell my parents something. The artist didn't often accept American patronage, and apparently an American tourist, upon entering his studio, had once asked in dismay, "Is this the only stuff you do?" But Berber had been persuaded at last that my parents were sincere, and he decided to let them have 2 paintings. When I was old enough to categorize such things, I came to think of them as the red painting and the blue. In the first, the rectangular canvas is divided perfectly in half. A woman watches from the top portion. Her long neck is visible, her elaborate headdress dotted with speckles of gold. What at first appears to be a curved shadow behind her is in fact the dark torso of a horse, its head bending toward the white horse who stares up from the bottom of the painting. And leaking through both woman and animals is a ruby backdrop that charges the whole painting with an alarmed and pulsing beauty. By contrast, the blue painting is a sight of serenity. At the bottom of the canvas, the top half of a woman. The shape of her headdress mirrors the city behind her, a skyline of narrow turrets and onion domes. The ever blue of sky is streaked with gilding, its metallic shimmer like a constant nightfall. Later, I would understand that in these women, I saw the visual echoes of religious icons. There was something both ornate and plain about the paintings. The women were luminous, holy, their faces rounded like porcelain bowls glimmering with hand-applied gold leaf, their pointed chins perching on the tall formed stems of their necks, the continuous slender lines of eyebrow joined to nose, joined to eyebrow, and the delicate dots of their mouths. The artist treated the women with tenderness, his brush respectful against their features. Throughout my childhood, the 2 women watched me like a pair of tranquil guardians from their elevated position on the wall of the dining room. They were there through hundreds of evening meals, the many afternoons I did my homework at the long table that seated 8. In college, when I first read Plato's Phaedrus, I thought about the 2 horses in the red painting, the pale one rearing back, attempting to escape the frame, and the other a muscular shadow leaning over to nip the neck of its companion. In the case of the human soul, Plato writes, first of all, it is a pair of horses that the charioteer dominates. One of them is noble and handsome and of good breeding, while the other is the very opposite, so that our charioteer necessarily has a difficult and troublesome task. Throughout my childhood, too, we lived in places that might have been called divided. Consider the linguistic discord of Belgium, the international push-pull over Zaire's natural resources, and Poland, which so often throughout its history was merely territory to be invaded by the armies of its more powerful neighbors. But no country seemed more divided than Yugoslavia, its soul dragged in opposing directions like a charioteer pulled by a pair of antagonistic horses. My parents speak about how much they loved their time in Belgrade and Zagreb. They remember the roasted meats, the assertive green of the olive oils, the sturdy, rough table wines. The people were so warm, they tell me. But my mother says it was unwise to mention the Croats to the Serbs or the Serbs to the Croats. Then she explains the response was always, those terrible, terrible people. Most Americans can't understand this kind of long history. Both sides talking about battles that occurred 800 years before, as if the wars had happened yesterday. For nearly 40 years until his death in 1980, the dictator known as Tito governed Yugoslavia, a nation state composed of 6 distinct socialist republics: Bosnia and Herzegovina, Croatia, Macedonia, Montenegro, Serbia, and Slovenia. Named president for life in 1974, Tito kept control of the country and tamped down on ancient ethnic conflicts. By the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989, Yugoslavia was moving toward dissolution. Communist rule no longer a restraint on old, well-tended hatreds. What followed was the rise of nationalism in the former Yugoslavia. Wars were in Croatia, Bosnia and Herzegovina, and Kosovo, as well as conflicts in Macedonia and the Presovo Valley. The worst of the violence was called ethnic cleansing, a term that ensured the United States and other nations could avoid the kind of intervention that might have been necessitated by labeling the crimes genocide. By 1993, when the war was well underway in Yugoslavia, we were posted to Brussels. One night, my mother told us that in addition to the bombings, the sieges of towns, the mass disappearances of civilians, there were now rumors of rapes emerging from the territories of the former Yugoslavia. No, there were rumors of rape camps. And my mother, with her excellent language skills and her knowledge of the region, had been identified as a suitable representative to fly to Zagreb and to interview Bosnian refugees. In an unpublished essay she once wrote for a creative writing workshop, my mother recounts how she felt at the time. When I received the message from a former State Department colleague that my name had come up on the language database as possible team leader, I had shoved the cable aside and tried to ignore it. Over dinner, we discussed if my mother should take the assignment. I don't want to go, my mother said. My father stayed silent. And although I have no memory of this conversation, my mother writes that I told her, Mommy, if you don't go, somebody else will have to. And what if that person doesn't believe the women? Believe the women. I would have been barely 17 when I said this. In her essay, my mother hypothesizes that I knew women could be disbelieved because I had heard her own story from 30 years before. When she was 19 and living in Miami, my mother was held hostage by a man who escaped from an institution, the kind of place that used to be called an asylum for the criminally insane. For nearly a day, he held her at knife point in her own apartment, saying over and over, "Tell me a story. Tell me why I shouldn't kill you." My mother obeyed. She told him about the college classes she was taking. She pointed to the textbooks that lay open on the dining room table. She bandaged the man's hand, which she had cut in the struggle after he broke into her rooms. "Tell me a story," he said. "Tell me why I shouldn't kill you." She offered to cook him dinner. Spaghetti and meatballs, she suggested, knowing she didn't have those ingredients in her kitchen, that they would have to walk to the grocery store, and that the store stood across the street from a police station. She took a purse from her closet. Its sides were sturdy, the bottom studded with 4 metal feet. She placed her shopping list inside the bag. And when my mother finally managed to get away from the man, knocking him over with a sudden strike of the purse, she ran and ran. In the police station, her neck and face and wrists still bruised from his fingers, the officers on duty didn't believe the story she told. Women like this were always coming in to complain about their boyfriend's fists. Go home, they told her. Just tell him you're sorry and won't do it again. And this is why my mother decided to go to Yugoslavia, to listen to the women. Thank you.
Oh, how harrowing and haunting and so difficult to follow. And I can't wait to ask you questions that I have. On that note of listening to the women, I'm going to start with a poem from my first book, The Many Names for Mother, because in many ways, it's a poem that led up to me writing all the poems since. So when I was writing Many Names for Mother, I was, for the majority of the book, I was pregnant with my first child. And during that pregnancy, I had the opportunity to go on a 3-week fellowship to Poland to visit the death sites. And this is a poem that I wrote after spending an entire week in Oświęcim, which is the town that was renamed Auschwitz by the Nazis when they invaded. The other thing to note about this particular poem is that some of you might remember this was, I think, this was 2015 in the summer when it was incredibly hot in Europe. And in the Auschwitz Museum, they ended up putting up sprinklers to keep the tourists comfortable. So this ends up entering into the poem. Against naming. Let's not name her or compare flesh to fruit. Let's joke instead how she swallowed a seed and let it grow inside her. Just imagine how heavy is that sound and what it must taste like in ripe summertime heat. I had no cravings though, only wanted to touch the cold or be touched. Polish berries carried winter, so I ate them by the bucket, gooseberries, currants, sour cherries, bursting childhood in my mouth, a past made sweeter by its being past. My mother sweating through Tolkuchka, the little push and shove bazaar, only to come home with a stained skirt and fruit dangling from her ears and me hungry inside her. The Krakow market was a harvest too, the hottest July on record. And in Oświęcim, the camps didn't know what to do with all the people in such heat. So at the gates of Auschwitz, sprinklers appeared, for the children mostly. And you, my love, were just about the size of a heart inside me then, soft and wanting water and a past that isn't this, one not passed down. But I carried you there anyways, against my family's urges, against your future ones maybe, walked you miles across black ground, turned red, then gray, then left for colorless. The dead beneath us silent, the ones around us growing, and I sang to you of a golden city under a blue sky with its single star and flame-maned lion waiting there. You listened, my love. Perhaps the dead did too. Ashes rising in the creek and in Birkenau's waters, its purple wildflowers and big book of names from which we did not choose to name you. Valen, valiant, strong, unmarked by first generation or Slavic or fruit, but V for the survivor who refused to be named that. For the many numbered and unnumbered scattered there. For the woman who made seeds grow as gorgeous out of flesh as out of stone. So now I'm going to read a few poems from my newest book, 40 Weeks, in which I wrote a poem for every week of pregnancy with my daughter. my son gets a book and my daughter gets a book. They're very different books. And if you've experienced or know someone who's been pregnant and has gotten these emails that tell you, this week your baby is the size of a kumquat. Next week it's going to be the size of something else. And I found these emails both times through very delightful, but also problematic in the way that they objectify and gender and name an unnamed body that's not even a body yet. So I wrote all these poems. And I'm going to start with week 9, grape. Louse, the singular form of lice, small, wingless, you'd never heard of because you never find just one, like the note from your son's school saying one girl has them and she's been treated and you should check every tangle of your son's curls to make sure some haven't found their way inside. And another mother says she'd buzz it all off just to be safe, says he's a boy, so he'll look tougher anyways. And you recall how you were 3, then 2, when your parents nearly shaved you. And other kids wouldn't share the bench, would run away and yell and point, would laugh how you were infected and dirty and a louse, ruined, Jewish. So you'll refuse to cut his hair and scour each perfect ringlet, twist their multitudes around your fingers. And when you find only more locks, you'll tell him to sit with Evelyn tomorrow to remind her she is beautiful and loved. And this is week 9, Lyme. The face looks unquestionably human, the update tells you. Eyes have moved from sides to front of head, ears right where they should be. And you wander your fingers along their possibilities, wondering what human means. They say inhuman for the centuries your ancestors were cut from bellies, their ears hung around men's necks, their eyes backed into the skull or swallowed whole so gold would grow inside another's gut, or else they were burned so no man could taste such wealth. Inhuman for the women sewn back to back by men, their bellies growing away, so when they pushed, they'd show what body part tears first, the stitch or skin. Inhuman for a man taking you without consent, for all the taken women. But what's more human than such violation? From Latin, humanus, of man. How can your unborn child unquestionably come from this? Week 34, cantaloupe. The first color they see is red. The second, a deeper still. Your son asks about blood, wants to see it rise to the surface. There are times you forget to flush. He sees traces, bites his tongue or the inside of his cheek while eating cantaloupe. Red streaks the fruit's flesh, rock melon, skinned like the moon's. He asks why his mouth tastes of pennies, copper, the shade of orange turns when mixed with blood, the taste of oxidization, too much air and rust. He asks you kiss his tongue inside where it hurts, asks you sing about the hands because the other night you wept singing. А ты опять сегодня не пришла. And he was charmed, delighted even. А я так ждал, надеялся и верил. By the startle of your crying, что зазвонят опять колокола, и ты войдешь в распахнутые двери. Why are you crying, Mama? You lied, said it was a sad song, said nothing of where you're hurting, closed your eyes and sang in the womb-like dark of his bedroom about the man in love who begs the bells to ring again so the one he loves would come home and he would kiss her chapped red hands. And I'm going to end with one last poem, maybe on a hopeful note, or at least trying to reach for a hopeful note. Why have children when the world is ending? Killer whales have stopped reproducing. Polar bears are eating their cubs. Koalas abandon their young, breathless, nose low to the brush to keep from choking on rising smoke. They run towards the thousands, pounds of food we airdropped where earth stopped burning or flames just hadn't reached yet. Guilt for our part in this end, or fear it would come for us the same. We tell ourselves everything wants to survive, believe in life as circle, not line, in karma, if it means our endurance. We spread stories about wombats herding animals into their burrows, kangaroos hugging their rescuers, or foxes feeding baby bears uncharred Kandai milk. But animals know to rely on no one. Their own scathed hides and carcasses pile the roadside along bus routes to the local preschool. The children we chose to have must fight, gagging at the smell. My infant daughter screams at us for plugging the bulb syringe deep into her nostril. She exhales snot mixed with my milk, screams again, then sleeps. She doesn't know we've made this quiet possible. She turns her head away where breathing comes easiest and reaches for a warm body as soon as she can smell it close. She doesn't know the coral reefs are dead and sargassum reeks in mounds along Caribbean coastline, starfish suffocated under its spreading. And maybe this is why we've made her, because she doesn't know survival is in our hands, forgives us their indiscretions, and lets us hold her as though she were a world we could still save.
Lots of your readings were so beautiful. Thank you. I think you each have a question for one another. Meanwhile, if everyone else wants to keep the chat open, you can share some questions there, and then we'll open up the Q&A.
So I have so many questions, but I wonder if I could start with the idea of image and of a picture, because I love the way that that's where this essay starts, and that's such a big, architectural concept of the book. And so I wonder if you could talk about the way that an image, a particular picture, connects for you both to language and to the way language is able to express trauma and bear witness to atrocity.
Julia, that's of course a great question. So as Julia knows, I'm working on a craft book called The Wounded Line, A Guide to Writing Poems of Trauma. And each chapter in the book is about a different technical element that you can use to effectively write about trauma. And one of the chapters is on ekphrasis, so poems about visual art, but of course, ekphrasis is a technique that works across genre. And my argument in that chapter is that when we look at and write about a piece of art, inevitably we end up stepping back to look at that piece of art from a kind of more detached clinical space. And usually what happens is by looking at that piece of art, we end up looking at the self. And so it's a less lyric, but often more clinical way to speak about and engage with trauma, which can be useful when the subject matter is very emotionally heightened. Sometimes we need to be deep in that emotion when we're representing trauma through language. And sometimes we actually need the critical distance. And that's what writing about art can do, is it can give you that critical distance, because at first you're just describing and you're just explaining what you see, or if this is perhaps a piece of music, what you hear. Maybe you're describing the texture of the piece. Maybe you're even using language that engages with synesthesia, so the blending of the senses. And that work feels low stakes in some ways. And so it can be an easier way to then enter trauma, because you're almost tricking yourself just into describing what you see. But inevitably, when we write about works of art, we always end up writing about the self, because there's a reason why we've picked that work of art. And it's usually personal, and it's usually emotional, and it's often connected to personal history. So for me, ekphrasis at first was just a really useful, practical tool for thinking about subject matter that's like a live wire, and that I often wasn't sure how I was going to touch it. And so, if I started with a painting, especially a piece of art that I was raised with, that I felt like I was talking about just an extension of myself, this beautiful object. And of course, the book is also really concerned with the problem of beauty, and how beauty is pretty indifferent to horror, and how beauty often exists adjacent to horror, and how perplexing we usually find this as human beings. So, the example I give is those of us who were alive in 2001 on September 11th, and if we were in places like DC or New York, those places were beautiful on that day. The weather was exquisite. And that seems incomprehensible. Well, it shouldn't be so. And so I'm really interested in that problem as well, the problem of the beautiful and why it doesn't care. So thank you for that wonderful question, Julia.
Can I follow up, because knowing you're both a nonfiction writer and a poet, and ask about, the tradition of ekphrasis, I don't know, and you need to teach me the right way of pronouncing it. But it's in poetry, traditionally used in poetry. And of course, it's just writing about any other piece of art or music, and so it can be used across genres. But I wonder if you can maybe talk about kind of the choice of approaching it through nonfiction versus, you have other ekphrastic poems, absolutely, particularly ones I know of from Poland, where you write about a souvenir. The choice of writing about those in poems.
Yeah, I mean, so I don't really distinguish between genre, so that it feels like the same process to me in both cases. But what struck me in writing about ekphrasis from a craft perspective is that even the examples that are always cited as sort of like the earliest examples, like the shield of Achilles in the Iliad, or there's an incredible moment in the Aeneas where in the Aeneid, where Aeneas encounters an incredible mural in Carthage, and it's a mural of the history of Troy, and he starts weeping in front of it. Those are all examples of trauma. And so I think it's interesting that sort of the genetics of ekphrasis is with this connection to trauma, that we encounter these works of art, we're moved to describe them, and through that description, we're led to an act of self-discovery. So yeah, for me, the process was identical in writing essays and in writing poems that used visual works of art as the jumping off point. That's a wonderful question though, Julia. So Julia, my question that I've been thinking about is your term lyric witness, which you explore so compellingly in your scholarly dissertation. And that's a project where you're examining literatures of genocide. But as I was reading 40 Weeks, I was thinking that the lyric witness is also very much at play in that collection as well, except it's also being used not to just explore trauma, but as you said, hope and the possibility of joy, rather than representing just grief and trauma. So I was hoping that you could maybe talk about the presence of the lyric witness in 40 weeks, and also just tell everybody what that concept is.
Oh, okay. Thank you for that question and returning me to my dissertation that I've just, set to the side as something that will one day be returned to. So I read a lot of scholarship on both trauma and witnessing, which is incredibly vast, and arrived at the fact that in scholarship, we have lots of terminology for witness, from the intellectual side, and then direct witnessing. And it's constantly written in terms of degrees of remove from the event. So it's always about proximity and distance, whether it's physical space or intellectual space. And for me, lyric witness was less a concept of generational distance, and more a concept of the way, the mode through which one bears witness. So it's bearing witness through making the craft side of bearing witness very evident. So there's a way in which poets bring to bear or make very well known the fact that this witness is already at a remove. If we look at the work of Paul Celan, who, lost his mother, who was in concentration camps, he's a direct witness, but in his writing, he doesn't bear direct witness to the atrocity. And in fact, he forefronts the artifice of poetic form and the artifice of song in order to bring us closer to the emotional truth of the event, even as we might be further away from the historical truth, from bearing witness to the direct places, people, things that happened. So I haven't actually thought about how 40 weeks is engaged with that, but of course it is, because as I'm writing and bearing witness to the self and to my own body, I chose to write the collection in a second person. And I chose to write the collection in a way that would invite the reader to artificially experience these things that they are incapable of experiencing, even if this is a reader who has gone through a very similar pregnancy and a reader who also comes from a similar background. But in fact, that use of the you and the invitation of the reader to inhabit these spaces is actually to forefront the distance that we all have from one another's personal experience, from one another's trauma, and to hopefully encourage empathy, because we can never be in someone else's body, in someone else's shoes, in someone else's history. But that's not a reason to detach and to disconnect, and to say it's okay that I don't understand, when in fact it's a reason to keep reaching for understanding and reaching for empathy. So thank you for making me kind of question my own craft choices and how they relate to my scholarly position.
You both. For those of you who are attending, please do put questions into the chat as you have them. I wanted to pull together some of these ideas. John's work is looking at art, but also making art. And I think the very ending of the last poem that Julia read, "Why Have Children When the World is Ending?" The line, "Because she doesn't know survival is in our hands," in this act of what we are making. And then thinking of the essay, Dear Rose, where Jeanne is talking about sewing on page 112. I was really interested where you're writing about a mistake in the sewing and then going back and erasing it. And you ask the question, could a country do this? I wonder, undo its own tangles in the textile. And then skipping ahead, then I begin to advance again, the fabric on the loom lengthening. And we're a community of writers and people trying to translate our, as we all do in the arts, our experiences into something both for ourselves and for others, as witness, as Julia was talking about, and the making. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about how you're prompted to make these choices. Julia was talking about the emails we receive if we're pregnant of the various fruits and vegetables, which are quite comical. And then the art pieces that Jehanne is choosing, and how you're kind of, which comes first, if that's even happening consciously for you, and how you're making, and you're choosing these outside instincts to choose to write about something so large and then come back into the self, like the, I'm going to pronounce it probably wrong, ekphrastic work of looking in ourselves. That's a really big question, but I hope it makes sense. Either can start.
Well, I guess I'll say sometimes I start with a prompt, and because I like constraint. So especially as a poet, I love to say, okay, I'm going to try to remember how to write a sonnet again, or try to remember how to write a villanelle again, because I'm always persuaded as soon as I finish one of those that I'll never know how to do it successfully again. So I love working from prompts, but then of course, as you're working on a book, intuition or instinct also points you toward the next thing that you should investigate. So the first essay that I wrote for exhibitions didn't even end up in the final book, but it was crucial for a long time in terms of my thinking, because it was about a work of art, maybe the thing that my parents own that means the most to me. In the end, I just didn't think the essay was good enough, but it was a great launching point. And so I think that when you're writing a book, you are at times just pushing yourself along because it's very easy to stop writing it. And that might be to give yourself prompts or to give yourself assignments. But then there are moments also when the book takes over and makes decisions for you, and that's wonderful as well.
Yeah, I want to echo what Jehanne said. I also love prompts, and I love prompts for one reason, that they take you to unexpected places, that you wouldn't have necessarily gone yourself without the prompt. But two, as a mother of a young child at the same time, otherwise I wouldn't get any writing done. So even in my first book, there's all of these other women don't tell you poems. And in part, sure, it was all intentional. I really found that title very important in structuring the book, but also I needed a way in. I needed a way in when the world was bombarding me, when my child was bombarding me. And it's so much easier to start when you've already got a title and a kind of intellectual architecture. And the same thing goes with form. When you have a strict structure, both rhetorically and, lyrically, it can help you write what you still can't fathom, like what you can't understand yourself. That form takes over, similarly to the way a book takes over and might push you in certain directions. I think form does something very similar for me. And then I had another thought, Chloe. I thought you were kind of asking about this return to, both aesthetics and human creation. Is like, why do we continue to do this? To have hope. That's what I heard in your question. Or why do we even keep looking at art when the world is literally on fire? Not metaphorically, but literally. Things are not good. And I think I had a smart answer. And now in restating your question, I'm losing it. Oh, I found it again. I think for me, when I started specifically trying to figure out like how I'm writing about my family's Holocaust history, or now how I'm writing about the war in the place where I was born, and how I'm writing about all of these things at a great physical distance. And that the way to do it is not to provide answers in the poems, not to provide a turning that we can uncover something, but rather to bring us aware of all the things that are still not said, haven't been said, can't ever be said, but that's not an impulse to stop writing, to stop creating beauty, to stop perhaps having a child because the world's on fire, but actually all the more reason to keep doing it with very acute awareness to all the things that are missing, to all the things that are dark. but not to stop.
Wonderful. Thank you both. And it makes me think of what Jehanne was talking about, which comes through most of the essays, of beauty being indifferent to horror, and we're looking for something to understand ourselves and others, and to keep looking. I'm going to turn to Anna's question from the chat. You're talking about describing those emotions that the reader is incapable to experience, but how, there's a little thing covering it, but how to not end up being overly dramatic. So finding the right voice with this world on fire, I'll add.
I love this question. So for me, what I teach my students is often there's an inverse proportion between how emotional the subject matter is and how emotional the voice on the page should sound. Often if you're talking about extreme trauma or, moments of history that are impossible to overstate in their awfulness, it's better to be calmer and chillier. One, because you don't need to oversell the horror of the subject. But two, because sometimes that coldness is highly effective in conveying what the traumatized mind actually experiences, which is a fugue state or a kind of disassociation. And so there's a mimetic element. In other words, like it's imitative to write from a place of coldness, but also rhetorically it can be more effective. In terms like making one's argument, it can be more effective to be really calm and cold. Now, sometimes a poem doesn't want to do that, or an essay doesn't want to do that. But frequently, like being really chilly can be a way to convey exactly how awful and terrible something is.
Your comments bring me to a talk I just went to that talked about when we're writing about acute trauma or even experiencing acute trauma, the reaction is often PTSD, right? So there's like a recurrent, we're reliving it over and over again through mind and body. But when it comes to chronic trauma, something that's generational, or for example, domestic violence, things that become routine, what ends up happening is this disassociation, this detachment. And so I think part of the question is how to make whatever you're trying to write felt, whether it's through this kind of acute repetition compulsion or through disassociation, detachment, which, for me, I return to form. Form is one way that can take some of the melodrama out because it forces me to cut it. How are you going to have that much melodrama if you only got 14 lines? Or in a villanelle, when you've got 2 refrains and they have to repeat and they have to change, how are you going to be melodramatic? In fact, you almost can't, because you have to reserve. Yeah.
Thank you. Often writers will be asking about what not to include and a protection of the others you are writing about as you tell their stories. I'm thinking of the line from the Dead class in the essays, "What is a seance but gathering in which we attempt to communicate with the departed?" And then Julia's poem, Week 21, Carrot, ending with "Far from his body, unprotected and wholly outside of you, inside her fingerprints became permanent." And this idea of protecting those that came before you, that you also want to share their stories and their reflection on you and the current world, what you choose or do not choose to write about.
I mean, there's such a responsibility when writing about history. I think I spent 4 months at the U.S. Holocaust Museum in D.C. on a fellowship. I was the first poet they'd ever brought for this kind of fellowship. And I found that I spent a lot of time just explaining what poets do and explaining that we too care about facts, and that I had a similar stack of books in my cubicle to the stacks that the philosophers had, and the historians and the sociologists. So I think there is an added burden and responsibility that comes, and an ethical responsibility that comes when you're writing, especially about historically rooted traumas. But also, obviously, the challenge of being a creative writer is you're also trying to get at like the truth of the thing, which isn't entirely the same as the history of it. And so finding that balance is really difficult. I think it's why what we do is hard, because we're not just trying to convey facts, we're also trying to get at an emotional experience. I don't know if that answers the question.
I think about this in terms of the very present people who are living. The dead, I'm perfectly fine writing about in whatever way. My mother, in fact, always says, would you let your great-grandmother, my grandmother is alive and well, would you let your great-grandmother rest in her grave? She just keeps turning and turning because you keep writing about her. And I'm okay with that. I'm okay with that. But the living, that's a bigger question. Particularly, I'm writing about my children, and I'm writing now in my book of essays very explicitly about my children, and very explicitly about things they might not be proud of. And for me, it goes back to Jeanne's point and the point I was trying to make. It's the truth of the experience. I am writing to get at the truth of my experience with them, not to disclose something that they might not want, seen. And I'm sure it'll change as they get older. And then there's more ground that I'm not going to tread on, because it becomes more of their story. But when they're little, I do feel a lot of it is my story and our very, very close relationship. So I think it depends on what is most important to you and your writing. And when I recall, when I asked Ada Limon this question, she said she always chooses the relationship. She won't write anything if it, puts a damper on the relationship between her and someone. And I don't know if I'm there. I think sometimes I do choose the poem. But I have the privilege that my family members often, even when they read my poems, they don't really understand because there's a bit of a language barrier. And with nonfiction, I'm more scared because somehow prose makes things much more accessible. And somehow they think that now they'll understand it. And now I'm going to be airing out more dirty laundry. So I don't know, as I write more prose, and I'm curious, Jeanne, if you felt this dissonance between when you write in, prose versus poetry. But that is something that I navigate much more carefully. I tread more lightly when it comes to prose.
Yeah, I do think that it's even trickier in nonfiction. Almost everybody who's mentioned in exhibitions got to look at the work in advance. The exception, and I don't know how I feel about this, the exception is I have an essay about my cousin who died of an opioid overdose. And it's an essay about the most beautiful exhibit that I ever went to, which was an exhibit of pottery at what used to be called the Sackler Gallery in DC, but it's no longer called that because, of course, the Sacklers have had their names removed from almost everything because of what they did to this world. And the essay is about how, in some ways, I can remember that exhibit better than I ever knew my cousin, and how I held him at arm's distance my whole life because he made me feel so uncomfortable. And I didn't, in some ways, want to acknowledge our connection. And it was a really hard essay to write. And my aunt talked to me and told me about the night or the morning as she found him dead. but I haven't shown her the final essay. I hope she would see that it's loving, but I don't know, because it is a chilly essay. Again, I was applying that coldness, that clinical distance, as much to my cousin as to myself. Like, I think the essay is critical of who I am, and the fact that I could love a beautiful vase more than I might love my cousin. So ultimately, I think I'm the one who's the bad guy in the essay, but I don't know how she would feel about that thesis. But every other essay in the book was vetted by the people who figure prominently in it. Yeah, you can see I'm still trying to figure it out.
Thank you. We have time for one more quick question. Andrea asked for Jean, but I think you could probably both answer. She writes, I sometimes use your poems as prompts in my writing group. Thank you. Can you talk about smell and taste as ways when it comes, how it comes in when writers are stuck?
Oh, I love this question. So I'm a perfume collector. I'm obsessed with perfume, and I've written extensively about scent, which is, I think, or I would argue, the least acknowledged of the five senses, sort of the least privileged, as most of us privileged sight when we write images. And then I've written about, I wrote a book about our sense of taste as well. And I just think turning to these senses that we might forget or overlook a little bit can be so useful for jogging things loose. So, especially taste, both the smell and taste are connected very much to our amygdala, which are these little almond-shaped clusters of cells in our brains that process memory and emotion. So obviously, both writing about either smell or taste is incredible for talking about the past or talking about buried memories. And I frequently love to give my students a prompt. If no one is sensitive to perfume, I'll bring in dozens and dozens of perfumes, and then they can pick one and write about what they smell. And usually that takes them to really interesting places.
I'll just say that Jeanne's poems are fantastic for prompts, and her scent exercise had me write such an amazing poem. So if you can have Jeanne come and do a workshop with you, you're so fortunate. And I love her and admire her so much. So yes, scent is amazing. And also it's the one that's most deeply connected to memory. And so it needs to be used more because it engages things in our brain that sight, sound, taste don't. You smell something and you're taken to your childhood, and you might not even know why you're taken there. But for me, it's because of lilacs. I've now figured it out. And I figured it out in that first poem that I wrote, where I smelled it and I smelled lilacs, and I was instantly taken to Dnipro, to walking around and smelling the lilacs. And at the same time, there was like a scent of urine. So it's problematic and complicated. And I would have never gotten to that kind of discord between the beautiful and the kind of disgusting without that scent.
Discord between the beautiful and the disgusting. I love it. We have one last question. If you guys could answer in the prompt, if you offer virtual writing classes. I assume we have the brown bag lit classes, but maybe you guys want to share any other workshops. Thank you so much all for coming.